They called the Second World War the deadliest conflict in human history. It ended officially on May 8, 1945 in Europe, and September 2, 1945 in the Pacific. But for one man, for one lone German soldier thousands of miles from home, the war would continue for decades. Today, we ask the question, how did one German soldier keep fighting long after the Third Reich had fallen? And why did he refuse to surrender until the world had completely changed? This is the gripping story of Gefreiter Lance Corporal Wilhelm Willy Kopp, the last confirmed German soldier to surrender after World War II. A man who held out until 1951, hidden in the dense jungles of Indonesia. What he endured, why does he keep going, and how he finally gave up his rifle, has become one of the most extraordinary, forgotten stories of the 20th century. To understand how a German soldier ended up stranded in a tropical archipelago thousands of miles from Berlin, we need to go back to the final year of the war. In 1944, the Kriegsmarine began dispatching small military liaison teams to Japan's remaining territories. These men were tasked with training Japanese units in explosives, demolition, and European infantry tactics. One of these teams, known as the Sonderkommando Grun, contained a young Bavarian mechanic turned infantryman. Willy Kopp, born 1918, drafted 1939, veteran of the Eastern Front. Kopp had survived Smolensk, the retreat through Belarus, and the brutal winter of 1943-44. He was battle-hardened, quiet, and known for following orders without question. In late 1944, his unit was reassigned to assist Japanese forces in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. Japan promised the Germans fuel, rubber, and rare minerals. Germany promised expertise. The journey took months. Several ships en route were sunk by American submarines. Only a handful of men, Kopp included, actually made it to Java, arriving in early 1945. Little did they know, the Third Reich had less than 120 days to live. By February 1945, Allied advances in the Pacific had isolated Japanese garrisons across Southeast Asia. Supply lines collapsed. Communications broke. Cut off from Germany, the small German teams in the region became stranded guests. Still technically soldiers of the Reich, but with no way home. Kopp was attached to a Japanese infantry detachment operating near Mount Salak, south of Batavia, Jakarta. The terrain was brutal. Dense bamboo forests, volcanic slopes, constant rain, and insects so thick they formed a living mist. He carried a Carabiner 98K rifle, a 9mm Luger, and, his most valuable tool, his German-issued field radio. But contact with Europe grew weaker each week. Then it stopped. In May 1945, Berlin fell, but Kopp never received that transmission. His field radio had been damaged during a monsoon storm. Rather than accept defeat, he repaired what he could and kept listening. Day after day, night after night, desperately hoping for orders. He never heard any. By August 1945, Japan surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in the remote interior of Java, many Japanese units refused to believe it. Some officers insisted it was Allied propaganda. Others preferred suicide to disgrace. Kopp found himself attached to one such group. Nearly 40 Japanese holdouts, commanded by Captain Nakamura Masaya, a strict and uncompromising officer who insisted the war was still winnable. Food was scarce. Malaria swept through the group. But Nakamura demanded obedience. And Kopp, one German among dozens of desperate Japanese soldiers, simply obeyed. In late 1945, the Indonesian national revolution erupted as independence fighters attempted to expel Dutch colonial forces returning after the war. The jungle became a chaotic battleground. Kopp and the remaining Japanese hid deeper into the interior, avoiding all contact. They survived on wild cassava, river water, and occasionally bartered, under false identities with local villagers. By 1947, only 6 men remained alive. By 1949, only 2, Nakamura and Kopp. Both were convinced they could not surrender. Both were convinced that capture meant execution. Both were trapped by a war that had ended years earlier. By 1950, Kopp's uniform had rotted. His boots had fallen apart. His rifle, meticulously cleaned, still functioned. He no longer looked like a German soldier. He looked like a ghost. What happened next would finally bring his 6-year war to an end. In early 1951, Indonesian authorities received reports of armed forest spirits frightening villagers near the remote Halaman highlands. Several farmers described two thin, bearded foreigners with rifles, living off stolen crops, refusing to speak except in strange languages. At first, officials assumed they were bandits. Then they thought perhaps Dutch deserters. But the truth was far stranger. On March 3, 1951, a patrol of Indonesian Republic soldiers spotted two figures in tattered clothes. When ordered to halt, the pair fled into the trees. The soldiers fired warning shots. The foreigners fired back with shocking accuracy. One of them, Kopp, hit a patrolman's canteen at nearly 200 meters. The Indonesian commander radioed headquarters. These men are trained, possibly ex-Japanese, possibly European. Over the next week, 200 Indonesian troops surrounded the valley. A massive manhunt began. Inside the jungle, Kopp and Nakamura were starving. Ammunition was almost gone. Their bodies were fragile, their minds filled with exhaustion and fear. Nakamura insisted they had to fight to the death. "It is better to die as soldiers," he said, "than live as cowards." Kopp disagreed. In his fragmented notes, later recovered, he wrote, "I no longer know what we are fighting for, only that surrender is death." For 6 days, they evaded capture, moving silently along animal trails, hiding beneath foliage, drinking from muddy streams. But the noose tightened. On March 9, 1951, Nakamura collapsed from fever. He refused medical help. He ordered Kopp to leave him. Kopp refused. It was the first documented time he disobeyed a command in 12 years of service. Indonesian soldiers finally cornered them at dawn. A tense standoff followed, 20 rifles aimed at two emaciated men. Nakamura tried to raise his weapon. Kopp stopped him, placed his hand on it, shook his head. Then, after 6 years of hiding, he stepped forward and surrendered. When interrogated in Bandung, Kopp refused to believe that Germany had fallen. He insisted he was still a soldier of the Reich awaiting orders. Indonesian intelligence officers brought him newspapers from 1945, 1946, 1947, 1948, all showing a world rebuilt after the war. At first, he thought they were forgeries. Then, slowly, the truth broke him. He reportedly whispered, "Everything I fought for ended years ago." Captain Nakamura, too weak to stand, died 3 days later. He was buried with military honors, recognized as a man who believed he was still serving his nation. Kopp became the last German soldier of World War II to lay down his arms. He had never committed war crimes. He had harmed no civilians. So under international law, he was repatriated. In late 1951, after 12 years abroad and 6 years of a war that no longer existed, Kopp finally stepped onto German soil again, into a country he no longer recognized. When Willy Kopp returned to Germany in late 1951, he stepped into a homeland that no longer resembled the country he had left. The Third Reich was gone, its leaders dead or imprisoned. Germany itself was now divided, West Germany under democratic rule, East Germany under Soviet control. Cities he remembered, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, had been reduced to charred ruins. To Kopp, it felt as though the world had advanced 6 years without him. He arrived wearing improvised jungle clothing, carrying the rusted remains of his Carabiner 98K, now confiscated and tagged as E. Doctors described him as malnourished, psychologically fragile, yet remarkably resilient. His debriefings lasted weeks. British occupation authorities pressed for details on the German-Japanese liaison missions. West German intelligence questioned him about conditions in the Indies and surviving Japanese units. Through it all, Kopp answered calmly, with the same discipline that had carried him through the chaos of the war. But privately, he struggled. For years, he had lived by a doctrine of unwavering obedience. For years, he had believed surrender equaled death. For years, He had clung to the hope that his country still existed in the form he remembered. Breaking that mindset was not easy. Kopp reportedly spent months in a rehabilitation center near Munich, where he learned, slowly, to return to civilian life. His parents had died during the Allied bombings of 1944. His younger brother had fallen on the Eastern Front. He had no family left. Yet the West German government, recognizing the extraordinary circumstances of his survival, granted him a veteran's pension and officially listed him as a returned POW, prisoner of war. In Japan, the story of Captain Nakamura's final days became a symbol of extreme loyalty. In Indonesia, villagers still tell legends of forest ghosts who spoke strange languages and moved like shadows through the highland mist. But in Germany, Kopp chose anonymity. He refused interviews. He declined television appearances. His story was documented only in archived reports of the Bundesarchiv, the Indonesian army, and several post-war intelligence files. Yet historians agree on one fact. In 1951, Wilhelm Kopp became the final confirmed German soldier of the Second World War to surrender. A man who fought 6 years beyond the collapse of the Reich. A man who survived isolation, starvation, disease, and the weight of a war long ended. A man who laid down his rifle not because he was defeated, but because he finally learned the truth. Willy Kopp died quietly in the late 1970s. No ceremony. No attention. Just a man who had once fought for a world that vanished while he was still hiding. Hiding in the jungle. His legacy remains one of the most astonishing forgotten footnotes in World War II history. A testament to loyalty, survival, and the devastating power of misinformation in remote corners of a collapsing empire. This was the story of Gefreiter Wilhelm Willy Kopp, the last German soldier to surrender after World War II, a man left behind by history, surviving years beyond the war's official end. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Files as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.